Sweltering temperatures from Beijing to Berlin to Boston. The heat wave is causing roads to melt and rivers to dry up. But is it just freak weather, or is this evidence of climate change? And will it get worse if nothing is done? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Shuli Ghosh. Weather experts are calling it the hottest summer in recorded history. Temperatures soaring above 30 Celsius have hit Europe, central and eastern parts of the US and Western Asia. In Russia, the heatwave destroyed millions of hectares of crops and prompted a state of emergency to be declared in 17 regions. In Germany, roads have melted and fish have been dying because there's not enough oxygen in the rivers. And in Greece, homes were evacuated as wildfires spread out of control near the capital. Guy Henderson reports.
Greek residents fighting to save their livelihoods. Some stayed behind, using whatever they could to douse the flames. Others fled. People in the town of Varnavas now fear for their homes as gale-force winds push the fires closer and closer. 100 firefighters are battling the blaze too. So far, no houses have been set alight, but memories of the deadly wildfires that ripped right into the capital Athens 3 years ago are still fresh in people's minds. It's not just Greece that's being affected by this heatwave. Temperatures in other parts of Europe are topping 40 degrees Celsius. In Russia, they're experiencing their worst drought in a century. 25 million acres of crops have been ruined, and people are struggling to cope with fires in some of the more isolated rural areas.
The fire is very complicated. There are no proper roads in the area. We had to make a road out of wood to get this fire engine here.
In the central Kostroma region, commercial fishing's been hit. This fish farm had to throw out 12 tons of stock.
We waste a lot of trout. We are so sorry about the fish. We bred them for so many years. We put so much time and effort into it. Our hearts bleed when we see this.
This band of high pressure stretches all the way from the Urals to the coast of the Mediterranean, and it's not going anywhere soon. Forecasters say the cloudless skies are set to continue well into next week. Guy Henderson, Al Jazeera.
Well, let me introduce today's guests to you. In London, we have Phil Thornhill from the Campaign Against Climate Change. In New Delhi, Bharat Desai, climate and international environmental law expert from the Jawaharlal Nehru University. And in Cambridge, Michael Grubb, Chair of Climate Strategies at Cambridge University. Good to have you with us, gentlemen. So let's start with the million-dollar question. Phil, is this a sign of climate change?
Well, it fits the pattern that scientists have predicted of global temperature rise caused by an increase in greenhouse gas emissions. So, as they say, no single event can prove the pattern, but when you can see that it's part of a pattern, and this year, 2010, looks set to be the warmest year we've ever had in recorded history, then you can say yes, it is.
Bharat, do you agree with that? The US National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association says 2010 is set to be one of the world's hottest years on record. Is there a pattern, as Phil says?
Well, I think if the scientific predictions prove true, probably 2010 might be one of the hottest years. But as Phil rightly said, I think one single event cannot be used as a yardstick to judge whether it's linked to climate change, because we need to have a kind of a clinching scientific evidence, whether this is something anthropogenic, this is something human induced kind of a climate change. If the nature has decided to change this way, well, I think we all need to keep our fingers crossed, and unless and until we have that clinching evidence, these freak events, weather events, cyclones, droughts, they per se cannot be regarded as a measurement to say that, well, the climate change is really here.
Yeah, that's an interesting point.
I do think we do.
Go on, Phil.
We don't really need. I think that's not really true. We don't need that clinching evidence, because actually the evidence has been gone over and over again by the world's best scientists coming together in the International Governmental Panel on Climate Change, and that, you know, they have said that the evidence is overwhelming that the Earth is warming due to for anthropogenic causes.
But the question is, Phil, whether this is causing freak weather patterns.
If we hang about waiting for the clinching evidence, we will never do anything about it. You know, we are 99% certain. We don't need the final 1%. Otherwise, we will never get to do anything.
But how do you answer claims or people who dispute that by saying, well, at the same time as we're seeing this heat wave, southern China, Scandinavia, northwestern US, they've all had cooler temperatures than normal?
Well, it's very simple, isn't it? You look at what the global average is, and, you know, according to the NOAA, this year is set to be not just one of the hottest year, but the hottest year ever. The last record was 1998 due to exceptional circumstances of the El Nino, but this year looks set to top that. And all the hottest years, you know, on the record have been in the last 10 or 15. I mean, the point is that the scientific consensus on this is very well established. There really is no doubt in the scientific world.
Well, let me bring Michael in.
That the world is warming due to greenhouse gases.
There is no doubt.
Well, I think what's interesting is that what's important from a scientific standpoint seems to be very different from what really stimulates media and political popular interest. No one event like this adds in itself much to the register of scientific certainty. The trend of data over the last years and decades is the foundation of the fact that the trends we're seeing are unambiguously of warming, both in the surface of the Earth, and you can measure it in the oceans as well. And the pattern of warming is very consistent with what scientists have been expecting. And that increases the probability of events like this. So whilst this event is of very little significance scientifically, it's another little index to suggest that the scientists do understand what's going on, and it's going to get a lot worse. What seems important is that politically in policy terms, this is a reminder of what the implications will be. But I think the former speaker was right. There's really no scientific debate over the fact that the world is warming. We've measured it in dozens of different ways, and that the only credible explanation that we've got left is that it fits our expectations of what pumping so much greenhouse gases in the atmosphere would do. It's roughly what we'd expect.
As has been pointed out, some dispute whether extreme conditions are a result of climate change. Research from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says greenhouse gases have already caused a 0.7 Celsius rise in temperature. And if we stay on the same path, by the year 2100, the planet could heat up by another 6 Celsius. But climate change skeptics say rising temperatures are a normal part of the Earth's cycle and point to evidence that the Earth was a lot hotter 100,000 years ago. This temporary rise in temperature, called an interglacial period, lasts between 15 to 20,000 years before cooling down again. Parrot, what do you make of that assertion that we're actually coming out of an ice age?
Well, I would say that this kind of a abnormal events and this kind of a periods have also happened in the past. I came across some scientific studies which showed that in Cambodia in I think 1412 to 1430 or so, it was excessive kind of a heating conditions which almost wiped out the entire civilization there. So you are talking about more than 500 years ago. In the year when India became independent in 1947, it was again an incessant rain and excessive heat conditions were there. So there are periods which come in the history where you feel this is very abnormal, and it's a normal popular reaction like Michael said is that is it climate change on the way for instance. So my submission is that these kind of abnormal weather patterns could happen but we need to again see whether it's a kind of a part of the natural climate variability.
Yeah, you see, Michael,
if it is
one of the problems
that is exactly what the scientists have to tell, how much is the human factor which is at work, and at the same time, also we need to be aware that we don't need to spread panic, You need to
exactly.
take,
and one of the things that doubters would say was, all right, there's a heat wave now, but just a few months ago, the same part of America was being hit by massive snowstorms and blizzards, and that adds to the confusion. Phil, what do you say?
tiny minority of scientists who are saying this. This is the really important fact, because for people watching, you know, they need to know, you know, what the scientific community is really saying. And the problem is, as I think Mr. Grubb from Cambridge said, there's such a big divergence between what the scientific community is saying and what the media is saying. And the big story here really is the mismatch between what is coming from the scientific community and what is there in the media. Just like, you know, what you're saying, indeed, as part of the media just now, because it is a tiny minority in the scientific community who are saying this.
Public perception is incredibly important, because that is what's going to drive policies forward. I mean, you talk about scientists, exactly, but then we had this UN panel being, you know, big high-profile case where they got it wrong about the Himalayan glaciers melting, and that is the kind of thing that sticks in people's mind.
That was one tiny detail in an enormous report. And, you know, the disproportionate way that that was reported in the media, and, you know, that whole business, that the whole story, you know, around that and all those things was exactly how the media get it totally out of proportion. And it's certainly the case that, you know, in terms of those doubting anthropogenic climate change, they are a tiny minority. If you look at the number of peer-reviewed papers, there are just about 0 that doubt anthropogenic climate change out of all the, you know, hundreds or whatever of peer-reviewed papers.
I take that point. Let me just throw something back. Michael, let me ask you, with that in mind, according to the Yale project on climate change, between 2008 and 2009, the percentage of doubters, that is, people who don't believe the climate is changing unnaturally, doubled in America to 16% of the public. Now, what impact does that have on trying to get policies and laws through to reverse the problem?
Well, I think that's actually a much more interesting question and observation than, in some ways, some of the previous exchanges, because the interesting thing is you look at the impact of the various debates, scandals, as was called, around the ClimateGate, the IPCC sentence on Himalayan glaciers. There's now been studies which have looked at how significant were these scientifically, how much has it affected the view of the scientific community, and the answer is not at all, really. I mean, it hasn't changed the fact that there's multiple data sets, well tracked, hugely verified. Nothing in the science really has changed in the last couple of years. A little addition to our degree of confidence in what's been said for a long time. But there's been a huge swing in public opinion. And I think that that is obviously quite problematic. As you say, policy responds, frankly, in most countries, more to public opinion and political pressure than it does to scientific advice. So I think it does pose a real dilemma. My impression, but I speak from a UK base, it's perfectly clear that both the previous government and the current government fully accept the scientific evidence. They acknowledge it's a very serious problem. They are trying seriously to do what they can to tackle it. They're trying to help the international process move forward. But unquestionably, a lot of scepticism, driven for whatever reasons from whatever quarters, does carry the risk of starting to sap the political energy to actually address this problem.
Well, of course, I mean, you as you say, you're in the UK, and you've been experiencing this heat wave. Does it affect? When that happens, does it increase the debate on climate change? And do you think it changes people's minds?
I think if it's sustained, it does start to have an impact. I hope, frankly, that people are wising up and not getting too blown off course either by the coldest winter we'd had for a while or by the hottest summer we've had for a while. I hope people are maturing, recognising that the weather always does carry some extremes. What matters is the underlying trend getting worse? The answer is yes. Are we seeing more extremes? The answer is yes. So statistically, people should be getting more and more recognising that, well, it's kind of what the scientists have been saying all along. But yes, clearly if a heat wave like this lasts, it's going to make it easier for people to accept the scientific opinion. And I use the scientific opinion because I'm very now uncomfortable with this term scientific skeptics. Most scientists by nature are their skeptics. They've been probing, challenging, questioning, verifying the data for a long time. It's now looking to me more like a sort of cult of denial from people who haven't really been looking seriously at the evidence.
Bharat, does all of this add up to more pressure on governments? Because we've seen the failure at Copenhagen. We've got another UN climate conference coming up in Mexico. Is there any ground change in the approach that governments are taking to this?
Well, I think this kind of popular perceptions do in a sense jolt the governments in power, but at the same time I think governments will need to be very cool-headed and try to see that, well, at least as far as the routine measures which the governments are expected to take, they are not guided by this kind of a, I would say, popular kind of a scaremongering, and I think media will need to play a very balanced role in this entire process, and of course, for instance, the government of India has been very concerned and has been active pursuing this kind of entire issue concerning climate change, including policy and legislative measures. The entire National Action Plan on Climate Change, I think they are taking it very seriously, including the National Solar Mission and several. That means the governments are at work, irrespective of whatever, whether the natural climate variability is at work or anthropogenic emissions, are responsible for this kind of a event. But we need to have this kind of a cause and effect relationship, between this kind of a freak weather events, and this is exactly what guides the popular kind of a perception about the whole thing, and that is exactly what really creates this kind of doubts in the minds of the people, that what is precisely at work, and I think it's a job of everybody to be cool-minded and to provide a guidance to the popular perception, including the media.
Okay, well, this is what
I think that is entirely disingenuous to talk about cool-minded. I think you have to respond to the weight of scientific evidence, as we established before, and that's quite clear. And I think it's also clear that governments are not doing enough. I mean, you just have to look at what the governments have said. They have agreed, in the international talks, looking at the scientific evidence, that they need to limit the rise in temperature this century to 2 degrees. And it's also quite clear the projections from what they're actually doing will not meet that goal. So it is quite clear that the governments are not doing enough to meet their own goals. What they've decided, taking into account the scientific evidence, they're not doing it. Now, that's really very serious. And the people who will suffer most from that are the poorest and most vulnerable people around the world, many of them indeed in India, but in other places as well. So there is a huge moral question here about, whether we act, and we really do need to act, otherwise a lot of people are going to suffer.
Well, Lou Leonard, the director of US climate policy for the World Wildlife Fund, would agree with that. He says the heatwave underscores the urgency of passing a climate bill that limits the fossil fuel pollution that is causing Earth's climate to change in dangerous and costly ways. Now, he's obviously talking about the climate bill that President Obama is trying to get through Senate. Michael, when it comes to sort of bills and laws and legislation dealing with climate change, it seems really difficult to get concrete changes through because other factors are at play here, factors like economy, like the constraints it puts on big business.
Yes, unquestionably something we've learned from 20 years now since governments really first acknowledged this problem is that responding to it is not easy, it's difficult, it's politically tricky to get the relevant measures through, certainly to get them deep enough to bite. In Europe, we spent a lot of the 1990s slightly flailing around. Europe did eventually pass some quite substantial legislation, at least in terms of setting a cap on industrial and electricity emissions, a scheme called the European Cap and Trade Scheme. That's been growing in its impact, become more effective as it's been tightened up. It's still, frankly, pretty modest compared with what the science would imply. And the US is indeed now discovering that getting this kind of legislation or anything like it in place is not at all easy. I think one of the really interesting debates emerging is not only who's going to suffer scientifically from inadequate and patchy action, But clearly some regions are pushing ahead. They are actually getting more industrial investment in low carbon technologies. China appears to be starting to decouple its position from saying we won't do anything until the US does. And actually there's more going on in China now on low carbon investment probably than in the US, partly because of the continuing political uncertainties over whether the US will actually be able to act even if the administration wants to.
Barrett, are we going in the right direction? Are we looking at the right ways of reducing emissions? Should we be doing more on green energy alternatives?
Of course, I think almost all the countries will need to move in that direction. I think we need to move away from the fossil fuel economy, you know. And I think a lot of governments are doing, you know, including the countries, you know, which had not undertaken any obligations under the Kyoto Protocol. In fact, I think, you know, it needs to be really very objectively assessed. You know, the countries which were you know, entrusted with that obligation, you know, the Annex 1 countries hardly did anything, you know, and that is exactly why, you know, that most of their emissions have grown rather than going down, you know, during this 2008 to 2012 period, you know. So, you know, in fact, the domestic, if at all the people are concerned, you know, the domestic public opinion should force the respective governments to fall in line, you know, and do much more, you know. In fact, I would say that, like, you know, including the country like China and India, they are more serious, you know. The energy efficiency is the buzzword. A lot of alternative sources of energy are being looked at, you know. Huge amount of money is being invested, you know. That shows, you know. So ultimately, I would say the proof of pudding is in the eating, you know. That as long as, you know, you can decarbonize your economy, you move away from this entire kind of a life pattern which we have been following, you know. I think we need to change our lifestyles, you know. I think that is exactly where, you know, instead of preaching to others, you know, instead of just saying in so many nice words, you know, we need to do it at the ground level, you know, and I think it's happening.
Phil, 80% of the problems caused by 20 countries, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, I think the really important thing here is that this is a really unprecedented problem, you know, the scale of it. So it's not surprising that countries are struggling, you know, to react on a scale to meet the scale of the threat, because it is completely unprecedented. And we need a kind of revolution in our ambitions, really. I think if you look at the figures and the seriousness of what the scientists are saying, we need, you know, a bit of a revolution in the scale of what we're doing. And yes, you're right, it is 20 countries or whatever that cause the vast majority of the emissions, and clearly some countries, you know, are more responsible than others, and that's why, you know, we in Britain, for instance, need to do substantially more than, say, India, because we don't have a need to you know, bring our population out of poverty in the way that they do in India, and we have a massive historical debt in terms of the emissions that, you know, we've already put into the atmosphere. I mean, I'd like to introduce this into the debate. This is the kind of revolutionary approach that we really need. It's called the Zero Carbon Britain Report. And it's a blueprint for how, you know, in Britain we could reduce emissions in the UK to zero by 2030. I mean, I'm sure it's far from perfect. It's a very ambitious report, and you know, I'm sure that a lot of the details would change over time. But this is the kind of approach that we need. OK, gentlemen, a heated debate on heat waves. Thank you all very much indeed for taking part in this discussion. In London, Phil Thornhill; in New Delhi, Bharat Desai; and in Cambridge, Michael Grubb. Now, just before we go, let me give you some feedback on our last programme, which was about the tensions between India and Pakistan. Tahir from Saudi Arabia says Kashmir is the root cause of tension between the two countries. The Indian army is breaking the rules and regulation in Kashmir. Thousands of people have been killed. Many more are prisoners. But Sandeep says when it comes to Kashmir, Pakistan has always conveniently brought up the UN resolution in which it points to the holding of a plebiscite. The resolution clearly requires Pakistan to vacate its forces from Kashmir before a plebiscite can take place. Well, if you have any comments about today's programme, then do email us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. For the moment, from me, Shuli Ghosh. Bye-bye.